Okay, great. It's recording now, and then we can both start recording on our voice memo.
All right.
Great. Okay, welcome to the Genetic Genius, Dr. Mark. I'm so excited to have you as my guest today, and we're going to dive deep into all about toxicity, the effects the environment has on the toxins of our cells, and even more. But first, I'd really like you to tell the audience just a little bit about yourself, your background, what your practice is like, so we can really get to know you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on here, Dr. Lulu. I am a naturopathic physician. I graduated from Bastyr University. I've been in practice for about 6 years in a suburb of Seattle, Washington, a town called Issaquah, and I practice at Cascade Integrative Medicine. And this is an integrative clinic where we work with naturopathic doctors. We've previously had MDs working with us. We have acupuncturists, psychologists, nutritionists, a whole team of integrative care to kind of work together to help people through their health journey. My practice really focuses on kind of three main topics. One is autoimmune diseases, anything from Hashimoto's thyroiditis to rheumatoid arthritis to inflammatory bowel disease. And that then leads into the gastrointestinal focus that I have besides the autoimmune, and this rheumatological focus with joints and muscles, whether we're talking about Lyme disease, kind of anything that falls into this kind of chronic complex illness is a major part of my practice. And then there's a small portion of my practice that focuses on just general primary care, making sure we're managing people's long-term health with their making sure their blood pressure stays in check, that their asthma doesn't flare up on them, and that they're, if they have colds or flus, that we help them get through that if they need support.
Well, that sounds great. It sounds like you're doing a lot of amazing things. I can't wait to learn more today on our show. Can you tell me a little bit about how you're working with patients from that environmental toxicity aspect, and how, let's talk about what do you think the biggest impact right now is for the cells from that toxicity standpoint?
Yeah, so basically over the last several decades, ever since maybe World War I on, from the 1918 up until 2020. So for the last 100 years, we've had an exponential increase in the amount of chemical burden and toxicants that we are exposed to. So one of the things in environmental medicine we try to do is really differentiate the word between a toxicant and a toxin. So a toxicant is something that comes from outside of your body, something like a heavy metal, a solvent, a paraben, anything that's outside the body, because the body makes and also is host to other chemicals that can be toxin producing bacteria. If you get a food poisoning bug of Campylobacter or Shigella or something like that, that forms a toxin in your body and causes some diarrhea, that's what we call a toxin. Where something that's more man-made or outside of our bodies, we call a toxicant. And so we're just absolutely bathed in these every day. One of the things that's probably I've been thinking about recently is whether or not people's asthma is, if we see any reduced rates of asthma flares in response to this kind of physical distancing orders that are in place throughout the world and country. And we're seeing a massive drop in the amount of air pollution because people aren't commuting to work every day. And so the solvents from their car are easily absorbed into your lungs. You breathe these things in every day. And for a lot of people, they might not be a problem. But for some people, they can be a major problem, and they can reduce the amount of glutathione or these antioxidants that are in our body and help us open up our lungs. And so it could be something from an air that you breathe in. It could be something that you drink. It could be something that you eat. It could be something that you put on your body. Women, for example, on average use much more healthcare products, deodorants, perfumes, whatever, than the average male. A man might use a shaving cream that has some chemicals in it. Maybe the shampoos have something in it too, but short of that, but a woman might have something that's a little bit more involved with lipstick or makeup. And all of these different chemical compounds have hormonal effects on our bodies. They have
Mm-hmm.
immunological effects on our bodies, and they can be disrupting the balance. And it's really about the total load.
Wow, that's great information. I love that. How would a patient know, or how would a person know if they were having some toxicity? What would be some of the symptoms that they might be experiencing? And then when they would come to you, what would testing look like?
Yeah, so it's really hard because it's not something that's in our cultural consciousness yet. We have a really
Mhm.
great ability as humans to kind of dissociate from some of the facts of the world. And so when we have a disease process that wakes us up, that can sometimes be a trigger to help us look deeper. So what something might have started as like, oh, my hair is falling out, all of a sudden as like the very first symptom, maybe that then triggers other things in your body to being fatigued and tired. And so someone who comes in with me, I'll give you my first example of a pretty strong environmental medicine case.
Oh, great.
This was a 25-year-old male, and he was actually losing his hair. And for someone who's 25, who, doesn't really have a history of hair loss in his family, he had a pretty good set of hair for 25-year-old male, and he was losing his hair. And I kind of thought to myself, one of the metals, mercury, can come out in your hair, and other metals can cause hair loss too. And this guy, I tested him for what is called a blood lead and a blood mercury level.
Mm-hmm.
And his lead levels were really high for someone in the 2020th century, 2020, 2019 world, where lead's no longer in gasoline. It's no longer in, I'm sorry, it's no longer in paints.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so his profession, though, was something where he was working on old cars, and he would chip the paint off of the cars, and the paint that had lead in it would be exposed, and he would be breathing it in, touching it in, and then his lead levels would rise from that, causing the hair loss. As soon as we figured that out, we were able to work on some simple things such as changing his exposure and
Mm-hmm.
detoxification pathways. So these can have hosts of different illnesses, from ADHD, diabetes, asthma, any autoimmune disease like Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So anytime you have an illness, you need to kind of think about, could there be a connection to an environmental toxicant? And what does the medical literature say about this? We have a lot of diabetes in our country and throughout the world.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a host of information and research that shows that these chemicals really impact how our bodies work and how our bodies process our insulin and our blood sugar, and make it worse, which aggravate diabetes.
Yeah, it sounds like that there are a lot of different underlying causes to illnesses that can be connected to that environmental toxicity. How would a person then get these toxins out, or toxicants out of their system? You were talking a little bit about that, but I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into, like, maybe an example of kind of a protocol that you would use, or I'm sure that you work with all of your patients because they're individuals in a different way, but maybe a basic protocol of some steps that you would go through, like sweating or something like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the first thing to recognize is that we're all exposed. Okay. And so, like, even as a naturopathic physician, for someone who's really thinking about these things, I'm still exposed. Like, I still have mercury in my body. How? I've literally tested myself. Like, my mercury values sit at about 3 or 4. Um, and so you should just always assume that you have a body burden, right? Like, one of the things that's important to understand in chemical environmental medicine is that these things are synergistic. So
Mm-hmm.
like 1 + 1 does not equal 2. 1 + 1 = 5. And so what that means is you might have a little bit of lead, you might have a little bit of mercury, you might have a little bit of solvents, you might have a little bit of, parabens in your body, and these are synergistic. And so you should always assume that you have some, okay? Because there's never been any like research that shows people don't have this.
Mm-hmm.
Tons of research is looked at for this for pregnant women and women who've just given birth, because the people who are at most risk for environmental medicine are actually the youth and the young infants. And so this is a really big issue. And so you can certainly test, and you can have physicians order different testing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard though, because it's like trying to guess what the number one chemical exposure is.
Right.
A good history is super, super important.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, like I live out here in a more rural part of, on the edge of Seattle, of King County. And, but I live very close to a highway. Okay. Now, right now, you don't hear nearly the same amount of traffic that is normally present, but all of those solvents from the cars are coming and they're moving into my house because that's what the wind and air is doing. And so your exposure to that is going to be higher. And so one of the best things a person can do, if they can afford it, is to get an air filter.
Oh, okay, great. Like a simple one for their house or something?
Exactly. Like if you have the resources to get a air filter, that is definitely something that lowers the burden. Now there's different like levels of quality of air filters and how they filter different particles out. So most technology is called HEPA, and it filters something that's about 0.3 microns, which is pretty small. But there are things that are even smaller than that. And so it depends on where you live. And what your exposure to, right? So like in the Northwest or in wetter regions, and if mold is something that is more common where you live, maybe a HEPA filter isn't the best thing to get. You'd want to get above a HEPA filter, something like a Swiss IQ air filter or an Air Doctor air purifier. These are some of the filters that filter below 0.3 microns, because mold toxicants and toxins are smaller than 0.3 microns. And so they go right through the filter. So my patients will be like, I have an air filter. And I go, well, you have mold toxicity, and that filter is like, those toxins are being filtered right through that.
Right.
So getting an air filter is an essential first step. The other thing would be a water filter. So even something as simple as like a Brita, right? I was just at the Environmental Health Symposium conference, which is a fantastic conference put on by some of the best minds in environmental medicine. And they had a researcher named Tyrone Hayes. And Tyrone Hayes is a PhD professor who studied atrazine. And atrazine, up until about 2000, 2002, was the number one chemical toxicant sprayed on crops. And this was before glyphosate took over.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons why all of the animals are changing genders, right? So you have a loss of male, female, and you have all of these males becoming infertile. Their testosterone is dropping.
Yeah.
And they're actually developing ovaries inside of their body. And so atrazine is, very strange. And so this is easily readable. And Tyrone Hayes is the researcher. And one of the interesting things, even though Brita wouldn't be my top water filter, a Brita actually says on the back, filters atrazine.
Oh, wow.
And so
that's great to know.
simple things as getting a water filter and not relying on the filter that you have in your refrigerator. And the reason for that is because most people, we forget, and we are in with our lives and we forget to change out that filter. And so if you have something external, or if you have something that's on your Aquacera is the top brand that I recommend for my patients. They have different grades of filters for this, for chlorine, chloramines, all different types of things like this. And Aquacera is the top brand that I recommend. And so moving from clean air to clean water, you then got your clean food, right? Because before we talk about treatment, about how to get these chemicals out of your body, nothing is more important than reducing your total body burden.
That's so true.
It's like you've got to reduce the amount of exposure, because I can give you some of the best supplements in the world and they will help, but nothing is more potent than removal. And that is really like a perfect example for my next, kind of patient who had intractable restless leg syndrome. And he'd seen several neurologists and things like this. And I really felt like there was a chemical exposure. And this guy had organophosphates. So organophosphates are a pesticide class. And organophosphates are also the same type of chemicals that, if my memory serves me right, were what we were using in World War I in chemical warfare, because they have really bad neurological effects on the body. They really impact our system that focuses on acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is really important for focus. It's important for memory. It's important for lots of muscle contractions. And so you can see someone who has restless leg and muscle issues where acetylcholine becomes really, really important, and dopamine and these other neurotransmitters. And so his organophosphate pesticides were off the chart.
Wow.
And they're hard to, so the first step I recommend for people is to avoid the dirty dozen. The dirty dozen is it's a PDF file that is put together by the EWG, the Environmental Working Group, and every year they hire some researchers to go test foods off of your grocery supermarket and figure out how many pesticides are on them. And there's a lot of things like let's say, for instance, celery, right? So many of my patients come in because I work with autoimmune thyroid conditions, and the medical medium is a guy who wrote a book about autoimmune thyroid and the connections to EPV. And one of his top practices that he recommends is juicing celery juice. Celery is fantastic food. It's got a lot of cool compounds in it, and juicing it can be an okay practice if you buy organic.
Right.
And celery is one of the most chemically sprayed crops that people consume frequently.
Wow.
So this is where all of a sudden something that you are trying to do that's good for your health actually becomes an issue. And while you might go to Whole Foods and think that they're juicing organic celery for you if you're getting a juice at Whole Foods, the reality is it's probably not. And so when you're doing juicing and stuff, you're able to consume these fruits and vegetables at higher concentrations because they're liquid and their fiber is reduced. And you're therefore really taking in a large load that you wouldn't be able to eat. And so if you juice, you really need to make sure that you're doing organic.
Yeah, that's so important. I talk about that all the time with patients as well. Like if you're juicing, you want it to be the highest quality that you can get. Even if you're growing it in your backyard in a great, safe environment away from the road is amazing as well. Can you talk about what aspects of the cells, the function of the cells, would be damaged by certain toxins from the environment?
Absolutely. So the body has amazing processes to help us with processing these chemicals, but there are many systems that get hit with environmental chemicals, okay? And each chemical has its own affinity for different systems. And so We can talk about the endocrine system, which means our hormones like our insulin, cortisol, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and the other hormones. There are the neurological systems, such as our neurotransmitters. There's the immune system and how that is set up. And so, for instance, we see in women lots of estrogen dominance. In men, we see testosterone rates dropping.
Yeah.
So testosterone rates have been dropping for 50 years. And when I started in practice, the range for testosterone was 300 to 1,000. It's now 250 on the low end because people are coming in lower and lower and lower.
Right.
So they're changing what the reference range is. And people think, oh, if I'm at 280 or 290, or a regular doctor who is looking at that testosterone, oh, you're in range. And they've forgotten that the range is just a statistical interpretation of the last 1,000 people that got their blood drawn. So let's take BPA, for instance. BPA is an interesting chemical compound, and BPA is going to be mostly found in your plastic water bottles when they're heated. It's also really common on your receipts. So if you're a cash register person and you're working, handing receipts to people every day, it's really fantastic that companies, I go out to, once a week, we go grocery shopping, and, you go to Whole Foods or someplace now, and they have different screens now for some of these people to reduce the amount of respiratory droplets due to COVID.
Right.
And, but we're missing the conversation of maybe these people should just be wearing gloves all the time because they're handling receipts, and that thermal paper actually has BPA in it. Now, they're also then washing their, taking some hand sanitizer. And the research has actually shown that when you take hand sanitizer, it acts as a vehicle to absorb more of the BPA than you would typically get. And so BPA has effects on the blood sugar system with our insulin and glucose regulations. And it can also act as a estrogen mimetic, and so impacting estrogen. And this is something that's not easily shown on a blood test, is what's your BPA levels.
Right.
And so this becomes complicated. So BPA is a great example of a hormone disruptor, and our organophosphate pesticides are a great example of our neurological disruption and how they affect that enzyme acetylcholinesterase, which is the thing that breaks down your acetylcholine. And when you have so much of these pesticides in your body, that actually causes inflammation in your body. And then our immune system. Lots of my patients will come in and they'll say, my white blood cell count or my platelet count is always low. It's normal for me to be low like that. And that may or may not be true. And so it's our job as clinicians to kind of dig deeper and assess through questions and potentially testing whether or not that low white blood cell count or that low platelet count is a function of their environment, or just that they are kind of on the far end of the spectrum.
Yeah, it sounds like you're really looking at the whole picture of the patient when they're coming in, because it's not just one thing that's causing them to be out of balance, but several things that then go into line with that cellular imbalance.
Absolutely.
And what do you think about the aspect of what somebody can do at home right now? So if we're talking a lot about people being more at home based on COVID, what are some things that people could do at home to help remove these toxins if they know, for one, that they have the toxins in the system, or just they're regular, like, I have some time on my hands and I want to feel better. What can I do at home?
So the number one thing that I really recommend for people is making sure that your sleep is dialed in, right? And so when we talk about like toxins, toxicants, whatever, one of the things, now we want to be mindful about, like, sometimes when we broach these conversations, people start to feel like everything they're doing is wrong. And that's not my
Right.
intention, right? Like our
Yeah.
intention here is to share information and say like, hey, like we can help,
Hmm.
by implementing a few practices, you can feel even better.
Yeah.
So my intention is not here to be like, oh, everything you're doing is wrong. But the
Right.
first thing I start with is light, right?
Hmm.
And so light is such a strong regulator of your biology, right? So we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the sun.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's these light and dark cycles that regulate so much of our hormones and our neurotransmitters.
Hmm. The
And so,
rhythm.
exactly. And it's called our circadian, which means about a day
Hmm.
rhythm. And our circadian rhythms are really set up based off of light. And so, one of the top things that I recommend for people, if they have the resources, is I recommend a company called Healthy. It's health with an E at the end, healthylighting.com.
Okay, great.
This is a lighting company that
Hmm.
NASA uses for their light bulbs and stuff because they have light bulbs that you just plug into your standard light bulb outlet, and you can control it with your phone
Hmm.
and or with the light switch. And they have three settings. They've got a morning setting, an afternoon setting, and a nighttime setting. And
Mm.
so if you were to come over to my house and have dinner or hang out with us in the evening, my house looks orange. And we've really cut down that blue light because the sun has set, and we're now, other than times when we have a blue really bright moon, there's a
Hmm.
lot more darkness, and that
Yeah.
regulates our biology, and that regulates your sleep. And so they've studied this in people with horrible insomnia in multiple controlled studies. And what they find is that when people have really bad insomnia, changing your light exposure is one of the most powerful things you can do. And so I
Yeah.
used to recommend blue light blocking glasses, and I still
Hmm.
do. It's one
Hmm.
of the easiest interventions, it's the cheapest. You can buy these for $10, and if you want to
Yeah.
get sexier looking ones, you can do that too.
Right.
But a lot of my patients, they try it for 30 days. I always ask everyone, you got to do this for 30
Right.
days.
Most
And
things they want to give your body time to
yeah.
adjust.
And so I can tell you from my clinical experience, I have had probably 1 out of 500 people plus tell me that these don't work. And
Wow.
so
That's an amazing
499
testimonial.
people, right?
Yeah.
And I still remember the woman who told me that they didn't work, and I believe that she tried them. But these things, everyone comes back and they go, man, those blue blockers, like these work. And I go, yeah, it's kind of how biology works.
Yeah. And such an easy, simple thing that you can do to shift
Yeah.
your environment at your house.
Exactly. And
Mhm.
so we're trying to use, we're trying to help balance our biology with
Mhm.
our current reality, right? And so blue light blocking glasses or blue light light bulbs, and changing out your light bulbs so that you're just your whole house, and making sure that you have flux and you have night shift mode on your phones. Like,
Mhm.
these are things that really are the first step that I would take for patients. The next step would be to get an air filter if you have
Right.
the financial means. And if you don't have an air filter, make sure that you're still practicing some kind of good building biology. And so building biology is this whole part of constructions of homes to make them breathe better. And so to
Mhm.
get a little bit of fresh air, because when you're having a little bit of a crack in your window, opening up your windows if you can. Again, part of that depends on where you live, right? Like if you live in a massive city where there's going to be a lot more exposure to different solvents and things, and you're
Mhm.
someone who has either allergies or asthma or something like this, then I'd probably say, like, let's get that air filter, really spend the resources. One of the godfathers of environmental medicine was a man named Dr. Walter Crinan.
Mhm.
And Dr. Crinan unfortunately died about a year ago.
Yeah.
but I'll never forget. I like stopped dead in my tracks. I was listening to a conversation with him once, and he said, nothing is more important. No supplement is more important than an air filter.
It's so
And
important.
we spend so much of our additional added income monthly on supplements. And look, I think
Mm-hmm.
supplements are fantastic, but when he said that, it really like kind of made me think and like really start to um, recognize the importance of our air quality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so an air filter and then a water filter. And if you can get those kind of three things from an environmental medicine perspective,
Yeah.
you're so far ahead of. And again, the simple Brita ones are the ones that I recommend from if like resources. And if we have the financial means, the Aquacera is where I would go.
Are there specific filters that you can have in your car? Because I imagine if you're in your car, well, most people aren't in it as much right now, but are there specific ones? And what about if you live in a bigger city? Do you recommend having one in your office location as well as your home?
Yeah, so absolutely. So for your car, I personally do not have one of these, but I believe 3M makes one. I believe it's called a Filtrete. I can get that to you after the show
Great.
if
I'll put
you'd
it in the show
like.
notes.
Yeah, and so these are ones that you can have in your car. Now, speaking of your car can also be a source of mold. It can also be a
Mm,
source of solvents. It can be a source of other chemicals. That new car smell that you smell when you buy that car,
right.
that is a very and now again, recognize if you smell it, it's in your blood and it's circulating throughout your body. And
Mm-hmm.
so one of the questions in our questioning that we ask them is, can you walk down the aisle of the cleaning product aisle in the supermarket without getting a symptom, a headache,
Right.
and if they can't, or how good do you smell? Are you like a super smeller?
Mm-hmm.
My wife, Anissa, who you know, is a amazing person who can smell anything.
Mm-hmm.
And really what that means at the core is that chemicals persist in her body longer for her to then pick them up.
It's like a cellular memory of that scent.
And so these chemicals are not clearing her body at the same rate. And because of that, she can catalog them better than someone who is processing them at a faster rate. And so for your car, mold gets into your car and water gets into your
Mm-hmm.
car. If water gets into your car, mold can get in your car. And I personally have had this happen to me literally in the last 2 months. We own a Prius.
Mm-hmm.
And for people who don't know this, as your Prius ages, the welding of the metal can actually develop little cracks in it.
Oh, whoa.
And yeah, it was shocking to me because I was driving with my wife and my 2-year-old son. And here I am, a naturopathic physician involved in environmental medicine. And I started smelling something that smelled really weird. And I go to the back of the trunk. It's not my car, my wife. It's usually my wife's car who's driving the Prius more. And there's some mold on the back of the trunk. And I go, that is weird. And she goes, well, I think it's just water coming in when you open the trunk. And I go, And I forgot about it for a week.
Mm-hmm.
And then I come back and I go, no, I'm going to dig into the entire structure of the car. There was literally 2 gallons of water where the
Whoa.
spare tire is.
Oh my gosh.
And
That
I
was
was
like
just
mold
like,
factory.
I couldn't believe it. We pulled out the interior of the car, and the amount of mold that was there. It was very, very upsetting.
Yeah, so it
Now,
sounds like you want to check your car for sure
you know,
if you live in a humid or moist environment.
or if you drive a Prius, and I'm very
Yeah.
much in support of green technology and all of these things for cars and stuff. But I used to, when I test people for mold, I used to say it's your house, your car, or your work environment.
Mm-hmm.
And I always kind of downplayed the car as a source of your issues. And I was absolutely amazed at what I found. Now for the work environment, absolutely. Like, many of my patients work in buildings that are either government owned or
Mm-hmm.
corporate owned and are very old. And these buildings are not well maintained,
Mm.
and they can be a significant source of exposure to a variety of different things, mold being one of them.
Yeah.
Living out in rainy Seattle. And
Right.
so, again, if there, now I'll give you an example. I have a patient, she is in administrative, I think she was a teacher slash administrator. I think she's administration.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but this woman had idiopathic urticaria, which is
Oh, wow.
hives of
Yeah.
unknown origin. Okay. And anytime you see this, one should always be thinking environmental illness if we
Mm-hmm.
can't
I
figure
had a
out what's
same
going on.
patient, same thing.
Yeah. And guess what? Her hives would go all the way. They'd go entirely away in the summertime.
Mm.
And then they'd come back, and these were debilitating. This woman would wake up in the middle of the night, have to go into a warm, cold bath and sit in a bathtub to try to stabilize her
Oh,
mast
wow.
cells. And this happened for 3 years in a row. And she comes to me, she'd finally, she'd have to use steroids, she'd have to use double antihistamines at high
Mm-hmm.
doses, and everything would go away at the summertime. And some people thought, oh, it's the sun, like it's a
Right.
vitamin D thing. And I go, I just, like
It doesn't
supplementing with
add
her with
up.
vitamin D in previous things didn't do anything. And I just didn't really believe that as the main driver. And we tested her for mold. She was extremely high. And she had changed multiple buildings throughout the years in different school systems, which is
Mm-hmm.
why she had discounted that the environment was part of the thing, because she had changed her environment.
Yeah.
But she had gone from one old building to a different old building.
Same kind of environment.
And so it's, yes, you've changed like where you actually work, but the context is the exact same. All of the old buildings, if
Mm-hmm.
they're not well maintained, can have mold in them. And I see this a lot in my firefighters and my cops,
Mm.
because these police precincts are very poorly maintained architecturally.
Yeah,
And
that
so
makes
that's
sense.
something that I absolutely recommend: air filters, because, um, you know, uh, it's unlikely you're going to build a new police precinct anytime soon. So
Right.
you've got to filter down and reduce your exposure as much as you can.
Dr. Mark, you mentioned mold testing a couple times. Could you talk a little bit about what that looks like for a patient or for mold testing?
Yeah. So mold testing can be tested. So primarily in a couple of different ways. There is urine tests, and urine tests are you pee, and they look at the actual what are called mycotoxins. So these are the
Mm.
toxins that the molds produce, things like aspergillus and ochratoxin, or stachybotrys, what people call black mold. And you can test that in your urine. You can also test antibodies. Now, antibodies just look at exposure. So they don't
Mm-hmm.
give us an idea that says, hey, this is an active problem and you're actively being exposed, versus you have been exposed. If someone only has, now antibodies testing is generally cheaper. And so if we suspect that and we need to save resources, if we find it on antibody testing and we have high suspicion and the resources are constrained, I generally ask people to save the resources they would have for the test and to go spend that on a good mold inspector.
To
Okay,
come to
because a
their
good
house or
to come
environment.
to their house, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
there you can find good mold, and some places the government will actually do this for free.
Oh, wow,
But
that's
a lot
good
of
to know.
times you do need to hire a person who
Mm-hmm.
is a good mold inspector, and you want someone who will not clean up the job for you. so that there's an independent kind of like no conflict of interest in that.
Mm-hmm.
But antibody testing is cheaper. Urine testing can be expensive. There are two labs that I use. One is called Real Time Labs. The other is Great Plains Laboratory in
Mm-hmm.
Kansas. The technology that they use is different. And so one is an ELISA and one is a mass spec test. And what
Mm-hmm.
that means is the Great Plains test is extremely accurate. And it will find things that may or may not be as clinically relevant. Now, if you have a really high Great Plains test, then that absolutely is something you should move on with symptoms and other things. But if you have a low level of mycotoxin, it's possible that you maybe picked up that low level just from a small amount of food source,
So you can pick
rather
it up from
than,
a food source too.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Again, like the, for instance, grains, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
in our country, grains are stored in these silos, and in these silos, they are there's mold there, and these
Right.
mycotoxins can be in our foods. They are in our food supply, and they can be ingested, and amounts can be absorbed. Now, in general, my current thinking, and I'm open to changing my opinion on this, but my current thinking is I'm much more concerned about water damaged buildings, water
Mm-hmm.
intrusion, active in, issues like that. The real-time labs test is a different test that in some instances is less sensitive, but if you have a positive to that, it actually may be more clinically meaningful. So Great Plains might pick up a little bit of ochratoxin from some of your
Mm-hmm.
wheat that you might be eating, but real-time labs might miss it. But if you have a real-time lab test that is positive, then it's probably a really significant positive.
That's great. It's so good to know that there's actual testing for mold because, there's mold where I live here in Asheville. There's mold everywhere around the world. When some people don't think that it's a possible factor in their root cause of their illness, which can be detrimental to them.
Yeah.
Um,
One of the best resources, really, I'll just throw this out here, is called
mhm,
a visual contrast sensitivity test. And so you can go to vcstesting.com,
mhm.
and this is a test that is like an eye test off of your computer that looks at your visual contrast capability. And this has been, I believe, validated to really help understand if there is a mold issue, because when you're burdened with mycotoxins, your visual contrast sensitivity is poor.
Is that similar to iridology? Or what's the spectrum? Is it like a light spectrum that's looking at your eye specifically?
Yeah, so it's a series of different circles that have different shades in them at different quadrants of the test. And
Mm-hmm.
so there are different levels of how this is marked. And it's asking to see whether or not you can see the different shades of white versus dark inside of a circle.
Whoa,
So
that's
it's not
fascinating.
yeah, so it's not really necessary iridology, but it's
Right.
actually like your optometrist or your ophthalmologist should
Mm-hmm.
very much be aware of visual contrast testing.
Oh, that's great. And they can just access that test online if they'd like.
Absolutely, you can access that
Great.
test online. There are also questionnaires that people
Mm-hmm.
can plug in, and then there's an algorithm that goes like, oh, it's likely that you may have Lyme or mold, and
Mm-hmm.
you might want to work with a practitioner to help dig deeper.
Great. That's wonderful information. I'd kind of like to switch gears a little bit, if that's okay, and talk
Please.
about the COVID because it's a big topic right now, and I'd love some of your insight about what you think I've been thinking about. We have the immediate impact of the COVID virus. What do you think the long-term impact will be for people, not only from an immune standpoint, which is a big part of your clinical practice, but how about from that kind of like stress focus and the actual neurological system? Do you think that's also going to be impacted?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so many different things to talk about with
Yeah.
coronavirus. so there's the financial impact, there's the emotional impact.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as human beings, we're social beings. And one of the things that, whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, even introverts need some amount of social connection.
Mm-hmm.
And we help regulate our emotional system through social connection. And this is a very, very potent medicine. People are medicine.
Yeah.
And I really believe that. So when you go to a yoga class, like, I don't believe it's just the hot or just the poses or the
Right.
stretches or the strength, but it's also just being with people. And it's all of it. And so um, we're totally seeing, anxieties, depressions, other types of mental health be impacted by this,
Mm-hmm.
both from a setting of concern, fear, whether it's someone you know or just your own fear of getting this, but also, people not going to work.
Right.
And I have patients whose routine and that kind of um, for a lot of people in mental health, routine can be very, very helpful.
Right.
And
Having a
when the routine
schedule.
is disrupted, exactly. And when that is disrupted, this really impacts how they're able to regulate their emotional health.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing about this is with people, working from home, we'll also see people are staying up later. A lot of my patients are telling me, "Oh, I'm staying up later because I can just hop on this Zoom call and go to work on my meetings with a shirt on and my PJs on the bottom, and walk out of bed 15 minutes later. And because I'm getting up later, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
bed later, and that is also causing shifts in your neurology and neurotransmitters and your stress levels. And
Yeah,
so,
affecting your rhythm, like you talked earlier. There's sleep rhythm and circadian rhythm.
absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. So, when we stay up, we have to mobilize energy to keep us up.
Mm-hmm.
And to do that, we need cortisol. And cortisol is that stress hormone. And cortisol is supposed to be really high in the morning and really low in the evening.
Mm-hmm.
And melatonin is the opposite, where it's supposed to be really low in the morning and really high in the evening. And as we push ourselves later and later into the evening, we're raising our cortisol and we're suppressing our melatonin because we're
Mm-hmm.
looking at screens and we're watching different things later and later and later in the night. And this then has downstream effects on our serotonin. Cortisol impacts your serotonin system. And then it feels harder and harder to get out of bed because
Right.
cortisol is what wakes you up in the morning,
Mm-hmm.
gets you going. And when you feel that you can't get out of bed, which is common in depression, there's a cortisol dysregulation there.
Yeah, I've seen that so much with my patients over the past 6 weeks, a real shift. Like some of them are doing, a completely different 180 because their stress level has reduced. But then some patients have actually been working more than they ever have because they have, like an IT job where they're working from home or something. So it's been very interesting to see that shift with them emotionally. So I think stress
Yeah,
it's going to have all different types of impact. Some people, I'm hoping, won't go back to the stressors in their life that were previously causing them such a change.
absolutely. Yeah.
What would you recommend? What are your, let's say, just top 5 recommendations for supporting the immune system or the immune system? Like I think you were just touching base with that about sleep. It's really connected to lots of, our body, like stress is a big factor that affects the immune system. So it doesn't have to be just immune support. It can be multifaceted. But what would be your top 5 if you're going to say, like, these are what I'm really recommending to bring on board to help support you during this COVID or coronavirus time, but also kind of like in the after effects as well, which we're going to see, I think, for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, when we talk about immune support during viral illness, we have, as naturopathic physicians, like a fantastic history and education around herbal medicine and
Mm-hmm.
nutritional medicine. And the reason for that is that these viruses and these types of other infections, like they go through other biological systems too. So for instance, the COVID-19 SARS coronavirus 2,
Mm-hmm.
we currently believe came from a bat. It was then picked up by, I believe it's called a pangolin,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was people believe poached. That animal was poached. It kind of looks like a raccoon with scales on it. It's like a
It's very
small
strange.
animal. Yeah, you can look up what a pangolin looks like, but this was believed to be poached by a person, and then they were using it either for medicinal purposes, for its in Chinese medicine, they use lots of different animals and different
Mm-hmm.
plants for their medicinal purposes and properties, or it might have been used for eating. And then that person got sick with this coronavirus. It jumped from an animal virus to now a human.
Right.
And so now this is a virus that is kind of in the human population. And so um, many herbs have tons of antiviral properties to them.
Mm-hmm.
We've got lots and lots of data on this, both in human clinical studies and in vitro studies and lots of other types. Um, However, currently we don't have any research on any of these compounds for SARS coronavirus 2, COVID-2.
Right.
And we do have a lot of data in vitro from SARS-CoV-1, though, for these natural compounds. And other corona-like viruses, one of them is called HL63. These
Mm-hmm.
three viruses, SARS-1, SARS-2, and HL63, all bind to what's called a ACE2 receptor. And
Mm-hmm.
an ACE2 receptor is how the virus gets into our bodies. And so some compounds that have been shown to inhibit the ACE2 receptor are elderberry, Sambucus
Mm-hmm.
nigra, and Scutellaria bicalensis, or what's called
Mm-hmm.
Chinese skullcap. And so when I'm making herbal formulas to help immune support and to help support a person for viral illness, elderberry is definitely something that can help both in terms of prevention
Mm-hmm.
and also treatment.
Yeah.
And there are head-to-head studies of elderberry versus Tamiflu, oseltamivir, and they show basically equivalency in their
Yeah.
efficacy. And so many of my patients, when I'm helping to support immune function, I'm using elderberry, I'm using Chinese skullcap.
Mm-hmm.
Licorice is another herb that has tons of antiviral, anti-inflammatory effects that help, that have been studied in Germany. There's an in vitro paper that SARS-CoV-1 was shown to be very effective. They took several different drugs, rabinavir and mycophenolic acid and other of these HIV type medications. And then they also studied licorice, and licorice actually, this was in vitro study, so we can't
Yeah.
really say that it has the same efficacy, but it absolutely was antiviral to SARS-CoV-1. Other parts to my formula are herbs like Eleutherococcus
Mm-hmm.
and lemon balm
Right.
as another antiviral supportive immune herb. Now, what I want to bring to the consciousness in this conversation, though, is this idea that, um, you know, just want people. It was like a call to like think about and look deeper into this, right? Because right now in medicine, people are talking about hydroxychloroquine.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the studies, some of the studies show helpfulness. Some of them show that it didn't really do much. Right now, we're in a time where we don't always have the right decisions to make the right information to make the right
Mm-hmm. Right.
decisions, and so we're trying to do the best that we can. Um, but another one of these, so what I mean by that is we're thinking too narrowly in standard medicine, and there are many compounds that nature has that we can be using for these types of interventions, or they should be studied, right? And it's
Right.
like, the hard part is that there, someone's going to say, well, we're not going to be able to make enough money off of these things. But I really believe that we have a lot of fantastic interventions in the natural medicine world to help with this. Give me an example. Malaria. So when we
Mm-hmm.
talk about hydroxychloroquine
Yeah.
is an anti-malarial medication. Okay. And if you actually get malaria and you're in Africa before
Mm-hmm.
hydroxychloroquine was invented, what do you think people used? People used two different herbs, and one of them is artemisia, and the other
Mm-hmm.
one is this herb called cryptolepis.
Yeah.
And these have been studied head to head against, I'm not sure if it was chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine. The paper was recently published.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? They do just as good
Or
in the
better.
real world, or better.
Yeah.
And so this is an example where people think that because it comes from a pharmaceutical
Mm-hmm.
company and it was made in a lab, that it must be better.
Right.
And what we don't realize is that nature has had thousands and thousands and thousands of years to try to help defend it, these plants or these compounds to defend themselves,
Mm-hmm.
because plants get infections too, which is why they make these compounds. Caffeine is an insecticide for the plant, to protect itself. It just so happens to help our brains in different ways.
Yeah.
And so the other things are nutrients, right?
Mm-hmm.
So besides the elderberry for prevention, or to reduce, binding of COVID to that ACE2 receptor, licorice,
Mm-hmm.
eleuthero, Chinese skullcap, and lemon balm. Those are some of my big five.
Those are great
Garlic
ones.
is something that can be used as well.
Oh yeah, garlic's awesome.
Garlic has a lot of research in viral load, in reducing common colds, and in reducing influenza. I believe duration, and I'll have to check the study about whether it was reducing its ability to get influenza. But other nutrients that are key for people during this time are zinc and
Mm-hmm.
vitamin C and vitamin D. And so zinc is something that helps to, viruses are these RNA or DNA type strands of
Mm-hmm.
information, and they need to then replicate. And zinc is something that actually helps inhibit replication of the virus. And this has been shown in many different
Yeah.
studies. And one of the theories people believe that hydroxychloroquine may be helping with patients is it acts as a way to transport more zinc into a cell. So hydroxychloroquine acts as a pH modulator of the
Mm-hmm.
cellular environment. It's an immune modulator. It acts in a variety of different ways, but some people believe it acts as an ionophore to help bring zinc into the cell so that it can inhibit more of it. And so zinc is an essential thing. Zinc you can get from both food and supplemental form. So oysters, if you like seafood, are a fantastic source of zinc. Other great sources are like pumpkin seeds,
Mm-hmm.
and these are great sources of zinc. You don't have to eat a lot of oysters to get zinc. One or two is a pretty decent dose.
Yeah, and
But
that's
zinc
really
in
good to
Yeah,
know too, because a lot of the supplements are being on a shortage, so
exactly.
it's like we're to go to our food source when our supplements or our nutritional value is so important right now, because it's actually, as a much better source anyway.
And one of the things I want to just say to that too is, I hope that this is also a call to action for people in our government and in our country and in our government for several different ways. One is, elderberry has also been back ordered in lots of different companies, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a struggle to find elderberry syrups or elderberry teas or elderberry capsules or lozenges or whatever. And, it's back ordered in so many different capacities. Well, this was a wake up call, and you can go and get an elderberry bush, and if you have the capacity to
Mm-hmm.
start planting it. My wife and I have bought 2 elderberry bushes, trees,
Oh, it's great.
and we're gonna, in a few years we're gonna have a massive supply of elderberries that we're gonna
Mm-hmm.
be able to start using ourselves. And so if you have the capacity to use some of these to grow these plants.
Mm-hmm.
Lemon balm grows like a weed. Like
Totally.
it
It's
is
so prolific.
extremely like prolific. And so lemon balm is not something that is difficult to grow at all. And it's a fantastic tea, whether you're trying to help your immune system or just calm down and have a good night's sleep.
Yeah, we just planted 20 lemon balm plants at the farm yesterday. So I'm just so happy to have so much lemon balm to help the veterans. I'm very, very happy for
Exactly.
that.
And Chinese skullcap is the exact same,
Hmm.
right? It's in this Lamiaceae family, and
Hmm.
it will grow very easily. Now, the difference in Chinese medicine is they use the root
Right.
versus the leaf in English herbal medicine. Um, but yeah, I just ask people to start to connect to the plants of nature to
Hmm.
learn the capacity that they have to be helpful, and for our government to start, developing studies and really testing these things out so that we can um, not be beholden to other governments for our drug supply. 85% of the drugs that we use in the United States come from India, and they come from China.
Wow,
And
there's a
I'm
huge
very
amount.
much a proponent of world trade and everything like this, but when we have national emergencies and world emergencies, we need to be self-sufficient,
Exactly.
have the capacity to be both from a pharmaceutical and medical equipment supply standpoint, and we need to be self-sufficient from our own capacity. And so, I encourage people, if they have the resources, to have, a good amount of vitamin D on hand, to have
Hmm.
a good amount of vitamin C on hand, to have a good amount of zinc on hand, so that we don't need to uh, overwhelm the supply chains when these things happen. you know these things are going to continue to happen. It's only been 17 years, since 2002 2003 SARS-CoV-1.
Hmm.
And uh, people got lucky with how hard Ebola was to transmit. Ebola was very deadly, but luckily super hard to transmit.
Yep.
And so when you have something that's easily transmissible and has
Hmm.
a moderately problematic mortality rate to it, like COVID-2,
Hmm.
um, then you get to this perfect storm. And so the more that we can allocate resources personally so that we are prepared, and to allocate resources in a national level so that our government can be prepared for these types of things. Like, we need to be prepared for these things, just as more of the natural disasters are increasing.
Yeah, and I loved what you were saying about the plants, especially, the elderberry and the lemon balm. And it's so easy to have a little herbal garden, on your balcony or your porch. If you don't have a lot of, yard space, you can just even have, 10 plants that you can learn how to use really easily to support your family and your neighbors. Because you can have, like lemon balm and peppermint, you can grow enough for an entire army.
Yeah, and I'll just give you another tip for your listeners, right? Which is
Yeah,
just
great.
garlic, right? So
Hmm.
garlic is garlic. When you crush garlic, it's kind of oily, okay?
Hmm.
And it's that when garlic is interesting, because when people in the supplement industry, when we use garlic, we use this chemical compound called allicin,
Hmm.
okay? And in allicin, is really the compound that people study for a lot of the viral immune supportive function of garlic. But the weird thing is that garlic doesn't actually have allicin in it.
Mm.
It's made when you crush garlic. And so what you need to do if you're at home is when you crush garlic, let it sit out on your counter for a few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
5 or 10 minutes is usually sufficient time. And that allows a chemical reaction inside the garlic to turn the alanine into the allicin, which is going to be something that, viruses are what are called lipid envelopes, which means they're wrapped in fat. Okay. And the reason why people say wash your hands all the times is because soap gets oil off of your skin. If you have olive oil on your hands, running water doesn't get oil off of your hands, but soap will absolutely allow you to disperse those fat globules, and viruses are the same. And so garlic, one of its mechanisms here is it destroys, that oil is able to penetrate the lipid envelope of this virus, of viruses, and provide antiviral immune support. And so let that sit out. Now, the other thing is, if we're looking for its kind of immune antiviral support, not cooking it is the other important thing, because it does impact it. So, you can, there are different ways you can kind of help get that garlic in your system, because it's going to be potent.
Good for staying home by yourself.
Yeah, exactly. A clove of garlic is very potent medicine.
Yeah, and it's great for circulation too. So, that's really great if you're at a place and you're not able to do a lot of your own exercise right now. I love you having garlic as a way to help increase the circulation, to get things moving through the system, to help the cells process any toxins in the body, which is great.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd love to wrap up some things today with a few last minute questions for you. If you had an unlimited budget right now, what would you use it for, and what would be your impact on the planet?
If I had an unlimited budget, what would I do with it?
Yeah.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I think that I would probably, I think it would go back to transportation and go back to our original conversation about air pollution and the impact it has on the entire environment.
Oh, yeah.
And so I would probably try to make sure that we could get cars off the road, and figure out alternative means of using transportation. And so that we are dramatically lessening the burden to the environment as well to our own health. Because I think that would be one place that, we might be able to make a really huge difference.
Yeah, and like you said, it impacts everything about our planet, our environment, all the species, everything is affected. And I'm sure you've noticed it where you live too. Everyone has been out, exercising outside and walking, and we've seen such a change in the wildlife. The bears are out more. So,
exactly.
Yeah. I know that's a challenging question, but it's kind of fun to think about too.
Absolutely.
And I'd love for you to just fill our listeners in on some ways they can find you, the medicine that you're doing in Issaquah. So you said, you repeat the name of your website so people can find you?
Yeah, sure. So I'm definitely going to be posting and putting more of my online presence out over the next few months. And so if people start to see me more, but you can definitely reach me at Dr. Woodall Woodall ND for naturopathic doctor. That's my Twitter handle. Twitter is probably the biggest place that I interact. I am on Instagram at Dr. Woodall ND as well. I'll probably start interacting more on Instagram over the next few months. My website for my practice of where I see patients is cascadeintegrativemedicine.com. If you are in the state of Washington to be seen, if you're looking for an online consult, we'll also put a link in the show notes for you to, if you want to reach out to me from like a consultative, non-primary care, non-specialization type format.
Great. And I think you mentioned too that you're going to be starting a new podcast, the Wellness Woodall Wellness. Is that what it's called?
Yeah, the Woodall Wellness Podcast. Yep.
Yeah.
So the Woodall Wellness Podcast. My wife is a nutritionist, and it's going to be a podcast that we will be launching probably in the next 1 or 2 months, and we'll be moving from there.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. You'll have to definitely get back in touch with me so we can talk about it on the show, and maybe have your wife Anissa on. We can interview you guys together.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mark. It's been such a great conversation. I really enjoyed it today, and I've learned so much about environmental medicine, as well as how your body can really change and make a difference with just simple things that you can do in your own environment.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.